first of all, I would like to thank you and for joining us, Robert and Aleksey today. I was asked to give a very short introduction to the topic before Priscilla present you as a scholar and colleagues. So our GPR, Grand Projet de Recherche, is a very interdisciplinary project, and we are interested both in biological and cultural evolution and the impact of climate on in this domain. And that's why, as you already mentioned, alcohol is such a central and interesting topic for us, because of course we are interested to know how the deliberate, but not for them, the occasional, but not for them, not the less deliberate consumption of alcohol in early hominins has begun now something that is extremely variable across human culture. So that's alcohol, and I'm sure that you will mention that it deeply affect our physiology. It also affect our phenotypic appearance, but also more sadly our life expectancies. Some populations are better adapted to the consumption of alcohol, but also alcohol affect our demography and our reproduction rate. In Africa, there are now a population that have been disrupted by the consumption of bad quality alcohol. So is become also a topic that an element that affect our gene, but it is also something that is very important for the evolution of human technology. Alcohol via fermentation and distillation, etc., are innovations that are clearly co-evolved with other innovation in human history, chemistry, physics. So is not just a food, but is a food that evolved along human history. And with something that we are very interested in, and we hope that this will be also a topic of discussion, alcohol is extremely important in culture, in shaping human culture, in its role in religious belief, in creating social bond between people. Is in other words, is a constituent trait defining cultural system and the way in which cultural system express and perpetuate themselves. And alcohol is also sometimes involved in the worst that humans are able to do. For example, in violence, we think, of course, at domestic violence, but we do not have to forget of the million of hectoliters of strong alcohol and wines drunk by soldiers during the First World War. I mean, the French soldier ate a huge quantity of wine. So these are just some few elements, I would say, ingredient of the topic that, and of course we do not expect you will touch upon all of them, but we hope that after your presentation, this will fuel debates and question between us and question, of course, to you. So thank you again for joining us today. And now Priscilla will briefly introduce you as a scientist and colleague.
Thank you very much, Francesco. Yes, I will be brief too. Just some words, because actually you Robert leads a lab called Animal Flight Laboratory, and I learned that your first interest was in colibris, so hummingbirds in colibri in French, exactly. And that they also actually eat some fermented fruits sometimes, and that can maybe affect flight and so on. So actually we found your research with your book published in 2014 called The Drunken Monkey. So I guess that it will be the subject that you will present, so I won't say something about that. But your group work actually in integrative biology, a lot on birds and flight adaptation, physiology, biomechanics, energetics. And one of your interests is on primates. And Aleksey is actually a PhD working under the supervision of Robert, and especially interested in primates and in chimpanzees, if I am correct. But both of them will present their work. Aleksey is a PhD in the group of Robert, of course, and so I guess that you will talk to us for 20-25 minutes each, and we can have questions in between the two presentations, and of course exchanges afterwards. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat too, or to ask questions, of course, directly after the speech. So Robert, maybe first, or Aleksey first? We'll let you decide.
Right, I'm going to go first, and let me thank you for this wonderful invitation to Aleksey and myself to speak about the drunken monkey hypothesis, about our research in the sort of evolutionary biology of natural alcohol consumption, and then the spillover into modern humans. As we just heard, alcohol is pervasive in human society and may have been critical in the origins of agriculture and civilization as well, although we know much less about that. So it's really a great pleasure to interface with a very different kind of audience. And you might wonder why I usually work on flight of le vol des insectes et des colibris, but why am I doing this? Well, I lived in Panama for 5 years as a postdoctoral researcher in the rainforest. So I was working on insects, but I saw a lot of primates, and most of them eat fruit a lot of the time. So I was very interested in the primate frugivory, how they find fruit and how they eat fruit. And then I was drinking alcohol from time to time, and I sort of just thought, why alcohol? What is it? Me, primate, monkey, fruit, alcohol? And then all of a sudden it clicked. I thought maybe there's alcohol in the fruit as well. And nobody had ever worked on that. That was about 25 years ago. So I'm going to present a deep time perspective on the origins of attraction to alcohol, and also some of issues concerning the excessive consumption of alcohol, alcoholism. So, oops, let me move forward here. So, we look at our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees, and I'm not a primatologist, but I spent a lot of time reading about primatology. And the more I read about primates and chimps and gibbons and orangutans eating fruit, and they're dominantly fruit eaters, they will eat 5 to 10% of their body weight a day in ripe fruit in tropical rainforests. I just became fascinated by the similarities between modern human behavior and chimpanzees and all of the other great apes. And there are just so many features of social interaction and mating behavior and feeding behavior and sensory ecology and cognition. I just started to think of myself as a primate, as a great ape. I'm not human. I'm just merely related to all of these other large bipedal hominids that are predominantly fruit eaters. It really is a fascinating deep dive into the literature about all of these amazing animals. And this is not taken by me, by a friend of mine in Uganda, a chimp smelling a ripe fruit. It's just fascinating to look at the similarities between these animals and ourselves. Well, a lot of evolutionary biology gets back to Darwin. And in a letter, he said that most monkeys would be habitually attracted to alcohol if they could get it. And in the 19th century, when the various Europeans and others were going around the world in boats, they often took on board mascots, primates, orangutans in Southeast Asia, New World monkeys, chimps in some cases. In some cases, they brought them back to Europe. And there's an anthropological literature to the effect that these animals were very fond of alcohol. You could give them alcohol, they would steal alcohol. They were kind of behaving like humans a lot of the time. Now, the phrase, if they could get it, suggests that there was no recognition that there might be a natural availability of alcohol in the real world. And that is basically the topic of today's talk. So I will present this overview, and then Aleksey is going to do a deep dive into actual chimpanzee consumed fruit. What is in the fruit, and then what is the estimated alcohol exposure on a daily basis, and what that might mean for our genetic ancestry and modern humans. Well, in addition to Darwin, il y avait Monsieur Pasteur, and he was a fantastic scientist, neglected in the English-speaking world, I will tell you, who really first worked out the origins of fermentation. Where does alcohol come from? Nobody knew. So he did a lot of experiments. He was supported by the French wine industry and the growers, and he figured out that it's actually a biotic product. It derives from yeast. So yeasts produce alcohol, and this seems simple to us, but it took a long time to prove this. So there's a process called fermentation, and sugar is converted to alcohol via a very simple molecular change. So sugar is a big molecule. Alcohol is a smaller weight molecule. Alcohol is very volatile, but this is a simple biochemical procedure or process, and it means that alcohol contains a lot of calories as well as does sugar. So fermenting means in the absence of oxygen. So these are non-oxidative changes in the chemical composition of sugar. Now, yeast metabolism is inhibited by alcohol concentrations greater than 8 to 10%, whereas bacteria have lower lethal thresholds. So we can make wine and beer at home, but we cannot get high concentrations of alcohol. That requires distillation, which comes much later in human evolution. So this process goes back to the Cretaceous and the evolutionary origin of fleshy fruits produced by flowering plants. Flowering plants evolved in the Cretaceous, and molecular clocks let us date the origin of fermentation by yeast to almost exactly the same window, plus or minus a couple of million years. So one of the ideas, and Pasteur alluded to this, is that yeast produce alcohol to kill bacteria. They are both competing for access to sugar. Sugar is a resource. Animals burn sugar. Bacteria burn sugar. So yeast could burn sugar entirely via oxidative metabolism. Instead, they just do a slight conversion. They create alcohol. Alcohol kills off bacteria, and yeast can progressively colonize fruit. Where there are fruit, there are yeast. Yeasts are everywhere. They are on us. They are throughout the vegetation, on the leaves and the fruit, on the trunks. And particularly in the tropics, there are many kinds of yeast, and many of them ferment sugars to alcohol. So I first wanted to ask, well, how much alcohol is in a natural fruit? And agricultural fruits are well studied, but these are very domesticated for millennia. So we don't know actually how they relate to wild fruit. So I thought, well, let's just assume or hypothesize there is alcohol in wild fruit. Let's go to a tropical rainforest. This is where I work in central Panama. There are lots of fruit, and they come in diversity of color, shape, size, not just primates, but lots of animals, lots of mammals, lots of birds eat fruit. Some of fruits are dry. Some of them have a lot of lipid fat, like avocado, but some of them are very sugar rich. And here is a palm. It's found throughout the New World tropics. The height of that large group of fruit is about 1.5 meters. So when that palm produces fruit, it produces a lot of fruit. Now, most of the time, it does not produce fruit. And fruit in rainforests is actually not very common. If I put you in the Amazon without food and let you wander around and try to survive, you know, it would last about 2 or 3 days, and then it would be all over. It's very difficult to find ripe fruit in tropical rainforests. Animals have evolved visual sensory cue ecology and capacity to see red fruit, so fruit changes color when it becomes ripe, but they also smell it and they remember it. And if they are social, like many primates, they tell each other where the fruit was last year and so on. So the point is, when fruit is available, it's available in abundance. Most of the time it's not there, and animals have to evolve sensory ability to localize and then rapidly consume ripe fruit. So could ethanol, the alcohol molecule, ethanol is only one of many alcohols, by the way. It's the shortest chain alcohol molecule. It's very volatile. It wafts, it disperses through the forest. You can smell it from the restaurants and the bars. All of the other products of fermentation give the distinctive flavor to particular wines. and fermented products. All of the bouquet derives from the longer chained alcohols, but ethanol is about 85 to 90% of all fermentation product. So here's what this process looks like in the wild. This is in Panama. We don't know how the spider monkey found the fruit. When they find it, they're happy primates. They eat as much as they can. They binge feed. They're very excited when they find fruit, and they eat as much as possible. So that's kind of a natural, oops, let me get out of it. So in Panama, this is the debris after a meal. We knew a lot of animals eat this fruit, and white-faced monkey and spider monkey have about 80% of their diet as ripe fruit. Fruit flies, I could talk for hours about, but they also colonize the fruit and they lay eggs on it and develop the larvae develop in the fruit. So this was a good target. So what do we mean by ripeness? Well, we have many different changes. Sugar changes, the alcohol content changes, the texture changes, and the color changes. And Aleksey will tell you in detail how you can measure and study these things in the rainforest. It's not a trivial problem. But ripeness more generally means suitability for consumption by a vertebrate dispersal agent. The fruit provides sugars, and then the animal can eat the sugar and disperse the seed. So the seed either goes into the gut of the animal and is dispersed, or the animal just throws the seed, or if it's a bird, it flies off with it and puts it somewhere else. So it's a mutualism. There is benefit. So now we have three parties. We have yeast, we have a plant, and we have an animal. The animal wants sugar. Animals in the real world are hungry all of the time. We don't think about it that often, but they have very limited energy reserves. They have to keep feeding. They search, they try to find food, they compete for food. If you can find these sugars in the rainforest, consume them as quickly as possible. Binge feeding, because otherwise somebody else will consume that fruit. What we have not measured are yeast and bacterial population densities. To test Pasteur's hypothesis, you want to show in the real world that yeast produce alcohol and kill the bacteria. This is very hard to measure. Even in the laboratory, we learned it. But this is how we study ripeness. And if you've ever tried to eat a green fruit, you'll see it's hard. It's got a lot of structural carbohydrates. It's nasty. You don't want to eat green fruit. You want ripe fruit. The complex structural carbohydrates are converted to simple sugars. That's what animals want. But in the rainforest, where there are fruits, there are yeast. Where there are sugars, the yeast will colonize and grow, and these fermentative yeasts produce alcohol. So the hypothesis is that these fruits will contain alcohol. So let's just start with color spectra. The fruit starts out as an unripe fruit. It then changes to an orange fruit, advertising suitability for consumption, and then it turns overripe. These are my anthropogenic categories of what I think this fruit actually is. But I did this ahead of time to see then how this correlates with alcohol content. So this was in 2002, over 20 years ago. Just the pulp. The animal does not digest the seed. So this is just the energy-containing, sugar-rich, juicy parts of a fruit. So green fruits have no ethanol. There's nothing there. They ripen, they produce simple sugar. Yeast converts simple sugar to alcohol. Some of them, it's a time sequence. So this is a snapshot of different fruits. So it's not as resolved as I would like, but you can see the overripe fruit, which is my idea, looks overripe, has the highest level. And so we get values as high as 8%, on average 0.5%. That's a low value, 0.5%. But remember, these animals eat 5 to 10% of their body weight a day. So the concentration is low, but the dosage is high, and it's every day. And the line is the inverse relationship between sugar and ethanol. Remember, sugar is converted to ethanol. Ethanol still has calories, but they are commingled. The substrate, the nutritional substrate, has high sugar content and also ethanol. So ethanol is a reliable indicator of the presence of calories. Animals need energy every day. In rainforests, they're really challenged to find that energy. So ethanol is a potential indicator of the presence of sugars, which they need for daily survival. So we just made some ideas. Fruit eaters use the plume, the odor, the bouquet to find fruit in the rainforest. and they may have concentration-dependent preference for alcohol-containing fruits. Alcohol is only produced from sugar. Where there is alcohol, there is sugar. There are calories. So they will prefer alcohol-containing fruits. That's a hypothesis. And then they eat. They binge feed. We see this in primates. They get energy. Appetite is positively stimulated. They feed more. They binge. Primates will share with their friends. But up to a point, their stomach will fill because the concentration is so low. The stomach will fill before they can reach psychoactive or inebriating levels of alcohol in the blood. These are just hypotheses that I just threw out there 20 years ago. Dangerous speculation. So, is there any evidence for this? Well, I'll let you read this. Stories of drunken elephants are common. There are no data. There's a lot of reason to suspect, yes, they are consuming a lot of these fruit. Marula is the most common fruit in sub-Saharan Africa. It's the most common tree. When it fruits large amounts of big fruit, lots of animals eat them. There must be alcohol in marula fruit. Maybe they're probably not getting drunk. Never been studied scientifically. Here's another one. Groups of drunken moose. I'm not sure how to say moose in French. It's a kind of large deer. Elk is another one.
Un élan.
Exactement. So wandering around the Norwegian forest. So these drunken moose are feeding on fermented apple crop in the spring thaw. And when fruits, apple is not native to Norway or Scandinavia, but they're introduced apple, but they have a lot of sugar, and then they start to ferment as they freeze in the winter, and they then produce alcohol, and the moose go after them. So these are just stories. And here's the real point I want to make, that wild ringtail lemurs get drunk on fermented lily pods, a kind of flower in Madagascar, is well documented. Well, this raises the possibility that not just fruit, but also nectar, sugar water in flowers may also ferment, which is a wonderful possibility. I tried to find the source for this, and after a number of years, I couldn't find it. This was from a zoology textbook, no citation. I talked to an expert in lemur biology who told me there is no such study. This is just anecdotal. So you have to be very careful when you interpret drunken monkey stories, drunken this, drunken that. It's all speculative. There are very few data. Here's what we do know. Fruit flies. Back to basic biology. They follow the alcohol. They smell it. They fly upwind to find the fruit. They use vision when they get close, but long distance, they use alcohol over hundreds of meters. If you ever open a beer bottle or wine bottle, and all of a sudden, there's a fruit fly right on the bottle. Where did that fly come from? It smells the alcohol. It goes to it. They mate on fruits. They lay eggs on the fruit or in the fruit, and the larvae develop inside the fruit. It's very well developed biology. Different species have different genetic ability to metabolize alcohol. This is important because evolution requires heritable variation in traits. And we'll see at the end of the talk that there's variation in modern humans in the ability to metabolize ethanol. But this was what really got me thinking. Lifespan and fecundity of Drosophila increase at intermediate levels of alcohol exposure. Toxicologists call this hormesis, nonlinear dosage response curve. So 0%, you have high mortality, compared to intermediate exposure, you get lower mortality, and then high concentration gives you high mortality as well. I couldn't believe it. These were studies done by different people for different reasons. 1983, relative mortality as a function of alcohol, atmospheric vapor concentration, a 20% reduction in mortality. That's a 20% increase in lifespan if you live in 1 or 2% alcohol. Now, that in the air, in the vapor where they live, why is that? It may be because the alcohol is killing bacteria, which cause infections in all of us. Fruit flies, we all have bacteria in our mouths. We eat bacteria. If they're through our body, they're on our skin. Maybe the alcohol is just killing bacteria and provides a health benefit. So this is true for fruit flies. It's true for rodents. I'll show you data later suggesting a similar trend in modern humans. Very controversial, but very interesting. This suggests there's a natural exposure to alcohol that animals have adapted to and take advantage of. So what do we know? Fruit eaters display patterns of alcohol intoxication in the wild. There are lots of stories of birds, mammals, even fruit-feeding butterflies. Butterflies in the tropics feed on fallen fruit. They scrape the juices and drink the juices. So it's highly anecdotal. Lots of indirect evidence, not a lot of real data. There are documented cases of alcohol poisoning, death by ethanol in cedar waxwings feeding on fermented berries in North America and in Western Europe. Though it's excessive consumption. But again, most of the time, the concentrations are so low, the gut, the abdomen, the stomach fills up, and they can't process it quickly enough to get to a very high level of alcohol. That's why we don't see total drunkenness very often, except in modern humans. And we really want to measure blood alcohol levels on animals in the wild. Chimps on breathalyzers, which the police use to measure estimate blood alcohol content. This is very hard to do, but it's a very experimentally possible system. So to give you an idea of the kinds of animals that are exposed to alcohol, 50% of tropical butterflies feed on fallen fruit. It falls, it ferments, there's alcohol, they scrape in with their proboscis, their tongue, and they get natural exposure to alcohol. This one is very obscure. In the great tropical river systems, the Mekong, the Congo, the Amazon, there are very large fish, 3 to 4 meter long catfish. When the forests flood and the level goes up, there are many plants that specialize to fruit into the floodplain, into the Amazon particularly, and they produce fruit. The fruit goes underwater. It's anaerobic. Fruit doesn't get oxygen. There are fermentative changes in the fruit that produce alcohol. These catfish will eat tens of kilograms of this fruit per day, and then they swim hundreds of kilometers dispersing the fruit underwater. It's an amazing system, but there may also be high levels of alcohol within these fruit these fish are consuming. And then, of course, there are things like fruit bats. This is one eating a ripe fruit in central Panama. Very widespread in both the old and the new world. So my point is that there is a large comparative biology of alcohol exposure. It's not just primates, it's not just chimpanzees, it's many things. It's insects, it's birds, it's bats, it's other kinds of mammals. This is what I call ethnology, l'ethnologie. It's the comparative biology of alcohol consumption. So let's get closer to humans. This is a chimp in a tree in Uganda. And we don't know how the chimp found that tree. Maybe it remembered it, maybe it smelled it, maybe it saw it, or it was an accident, or some combination. But we can ask the question, how does it select the particular fruit that it wants to eat? So we know in general, fruit selection involves vision, palpation, feeling fruit, and also smelling. And smelling, I'm hypothesizing, is mostly about the alcohol. First at long distance, but it may also be important at short distance in terms of selecting particular fruit. So let's just look at the video. So it touches, it's looking around, touches, smell, and then it decides to eat that fruit. So when it has a choice, it's smelling and can use that as one of a hierarchy of cues to pick the particular fruit. Now, we don't know what the alcohol content is in this fruit. The chimp is a kind of a messy eater too. I'll play it once more because it's just so interesting. And if you go to the supermarché and you look from a distance at people picking fruit or vegetable, you will see the same kind of behavior. It's amazing. They're looking around, they pinch a little bit the fruit, they'll smell the fruit, they put the fruit away, they pick a different fruit. Your fellow humans will do exactly the same thing. So this is one of many features I feel this is an actual jungle, a rainforest, but we have created the concrete jungle where we are surrounded by domesticated fruits and also many bottles of alcohol, not coincidentally, I would argue, of many different colors. So if you go and look at labels on different kind of liqueur or absinthe or all of the different wine, we use visual cues to select our alcohol, as well as the bouquet and the price and many other things. So, oops, let me get out of this. Let's go back in evolutionary time. This is a phylogenetic tree. We are at the bottom, Homo sapiens, but we have, these are the lesser apes, 24 gibbon species. About 20 million years ago, they diverged. 2 orangutans, the gorillas, our closest relatives, and then human evolution. And I've coded this. This is a very old graph. I apologize, but most of these animals are eating fruit in the rainforest most of the time. The one exception are the highland gorillas, the ones in Rwanda and Burundi, which are above 2,000 meters in the forest. And the plants do not have enough energy to produce big sugar-rich fruits. Instead, they produce tiny little dry fruits, and that's what the gorillas there are eating. All of these other species are eating a lot of fruit, and 50%, this is deliberately misleading. Most of them are actually eating much higher levels of fruit. So the chimpanzees are eating ripe fruit 80 to 90% of their diet every day, and they're eating a lot of it. Even if it has small amounts of alcohol, they will get high dosage. So I'm arguing there is an ancestry, a heritage of exposure to alcohol in the primates. Note also, these are all tropical animals. There's only one temperate zone monkey, and that's in Northeast Asia and Japan, the Japanese macaque. Basically, primates are a tropical group. They initiated as fruit eaters based on the dentition and the fossil record, and all of our closest relatives are eating fruit most of the time. Now, when humans evolve, modern humans, Homo sapiens, they're eating everything. They're eating sushi. They forage by the seashore, right? They're picking up things on the seashore. They're eating fish. They're catching lizards and catching monkeys and eating them. The early humans are also eating one another from time to time. It's a very rude and unfortunate behavior, but it happens in the fossil record. We know this, archaeological record. So I'm not saying we should all be eating ripe fruit all the time, simply that we may have inherited an ancestral bias associating alcohol consumption with nutritional reward. That's the hypothesis. So what does it say about excessive consumption? Well, I've always been interested in this problem. So it's a heritable trait, 0.2 to 0.6. 1.0 indicates a completely inherited trait. So alcoholism runs in families, well-known genetic basis for, we don't know the genes, but it's, if your parents were alcoholic, you have a much higher likelihood of being alcoholic. Remember, think fruit flies. If it's not heritable, it's not going to evolve. And there's genetic variation in enzymes that metabolize alcohol that is correlated with the likelihood of abuse within and among modern human populations. In East Asia, which is a cultural construct, but the modern approximate political designations of Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, there's a very high incidence of genes which affect a slow capacity to metabolize alcohol. People with these particular genes, only in East Asia, if they drink just a little bit of alcohol, they get a very adverse physiological effect. Red face, high heart rate, sweatiness, uneasiness, what's called ataxia, tendency to fall down. The metabolism of alcohol is slowed down dramatically. As a consequence, historically, people have claimed that alcoholism was very low in East Asia until modern times. And that's a very confounded cultural comparison. But if you look within East Asian populations, so you go to Taiwan, Japan, or Korea, there are alcoholics classified using local criteria. And the definitions vary by country and they vary by decade. There's no unique definition of alcoholism, on the contrary. But within East Asia, if you take people who are local alcoholics, they are 10 times more likely to have the enzymes that enable fast levels of metabolism. So it's the only known genetic correlation of alcoholism. In East Asia, there are alcoholics, and it doesn't say they will become alcoholics. They can metabolize alcohol the way Europeans can metabolize alcohol. It's a small minority of the population, but it's still a genetically based trait. So that's kind of interesting. There's also epidemiology, as with fruit flies, that suggesting that chronic low-level alcohol consumption reduces cardiovascular disease and overall mortality. And my final point is that high concentrations of alcohol are fairly recent. So distillation, differential vapor pressure of water and ethanol. To do that, you boil up a solution of water and ethanol and you condense out the alcohol. That turns up in the archaeological record, historical record, only in the early Middle Ages in Central Asia. The world's oldest known still for distillation is currently in the Shanghai Museum in China, and it's from Western China, somewhere in Central Asia, from about, I think, 1200 AD, or Common Era, CE. So distillation is very new. So the argument here for almost all of human history and all of primate history, exposure to concentrations of alcohol was very, very low. And the volume was not very high. With technology and with distillation and directed fermentation, we now can generate high volume and high concentration alcohol. But we still have this bias that associates alcohol with nutritional reward and overall fitness gain. So it's an evolutionary mismatch, a hangover between the tropical rainforest that we evolved in and tropical savanna and today's modern technological environment. So that's the hypothesis. Natural selection has acted on human ancestors to associate ethanol with nutritional gain, promoting rapid localization and consumption of alcohol. And more generally, if you have a hereditary behavior, it was advantageous in the ancestral environment, but it's disadvantageous in the modern environment. We have very high availability of sugar, fats, and alcohol. And these create diseases of excess, nutritional excess. These are modern, high, intense diseases, diabetes, obesity. These are huge problems, and they're getting worse worldwide because of this evolutionary mismatch. Here are the data for humans. This is somebody else's meta-analysis. Number of standard drinks versus risk of mortality. The studies to date, and they go back over 100 years, suggest that low-level alcohol consumption reduces the risk of coronary disease. In particular, it reduces the likelihood of atherosclerotic plaque formation, which occludes coronary arteries. So that is a major cause of death in Western populations. If you reduce cardiovascular disease, you have a much reduced risk of mortality. And that works up to a point. So basically 3 or 4 standard drinks, then you're back into the danger zone. And some of that may reflect a flip into alcoholism. 50% of highway mortality in the United States is associated with alcohol, either directly or indirectly. So there are costs to alcohol consumption, but there may also be benefits to low-level alcohol consumption in contrast to abstention, zero exposure. Now, this is very controversial, and you can find many, many people trying to do these studies. They are all retrospective epidemiological studies. We've never done a long-term, decade-long experimental study with modern humans controlling the amount of alcohol exposure. So there's vigorous debate, but I would argue this is like what we see with fruit flies. Low-level exposure to alcohol, particularly when taken with food, inhibits bacterial infections. That's the one possible mechanism. That's why yeast first evolved alcohol and fermentation, and this may have carried over into modern times. Most people worldwide do like to drink alcohol. It's kind of an amazing thing. Most people do not drink to excess. And why that's the case, I cannot tell you. But this provides the evolutionary background and a motivating factor for routine low-level consumption in social gatherings with food as an aperitif. And most restaurants make most of their profit on the sale of alcohol. If you look at the price differential between a bottle of wine in a restaurant versus the same wine from a different source, you'll see there's a very high markup. We associate alcohol with food. That is one of the predictions of the drunken monkey hypothesis. So other people have worked on this since I published this. In 2014, the book came out, it's gotten a lot of attention. These are tree shrews, close relatives to primates in Malaysia. They feed on fermenting nectar in this lower right thing. The white froth here is fermenting nectar, bubbling nectar. And they predict for this pen-tailed tree shrew, 1 out of 3 days using human-based metabolism, they would predict a drunken tree shrew. They don't see that, so they probably have better genes to metabolize it. They also have a secondary marker called ethylglucuronide. It only derives from ethanol metabolism. It turns up in human alcoholics. It also turns up in these species of animals that are eating fermented nectar every day. This was a great paper. Quiet, guys. About 12 million years ago, genetic reconstruction of the enzymes used to metabolize alcohol suggests that as the great apes, the gorilla, the chimps, and the humans became bipedal and terrestrial, they came down to the ground out of the trees, they were walking around a lot more, there was a mutation in one of the genes used to metabolize ethanol that made it 20% more effective. 20 times more effective, not 20%, 20 times more effective. The inference is they were being exposed to a lot more alcohol in the diet. And when fruits fall out of a tree, they land on the ground and they keep on fermenting. So one idea is that they were getting access to greater numbers of fermented fruits falling out of trees. That may have motivated, in part, bipedalism in humans. That's just an idea, but it's a fascinating one. And here's an example from modern humans. So in the upper left, ADH is one of the enzymes used to metabolize alcohol. It has a very high, this is one of the ones in East Asia, and only in East Asia, that makes people very susceptible to drinking alcohol. They can't metabolize it quickly, so they tend not to drink it very much or at all. And if you look at the highest incidence of this gene in modern China is right around modern-day Shanghai and central China. And then in any direction, it just decreases in incidence. And this area here is the historical site of rice and also sorghum and millet domestication in East Asia. And the symbols, the square, the star, and the triangle, are the archaeological sites associated with domestication of rice. So the idea is that this evolved in response that, and this gene, this particular kind of form of the gene turned up about 10,000 years ago, coincident with the origin of agriculture. So this is very different from what's occurring in the Middle East with wheat domestication. Why is there an association between rice and sort of domestication, storage, fermentation, and alcohol? We don't know, but this is just a very clear molecular example. So what do I want? I'm almost done here. What do I want to know? How do animals find ripe fruit in the rainforest? It's hard to do experimentally. Aleksey will tell us more about chimpanzees. What are alcohol concentrations within fruit? How frequently do animals become drunk? We don't really know that. I'd like to know that. Does alcohol act as a feeding stimulant? It does in modern humans. Everyone knows about the aperitif effect, and people have studied this. If you have alcohol with a meal, you spend more time eating and you consume more calories. It's synergistic. It helps you to feed. You like to feed. You have positive psychoactive responses to alcohol. And then what are the long-term benefits of alcohol for animals, including our nearest relatives? Is there a low concentration that just helps you kill microbes, kill bacteria? It basically gives gives an advantage, a health benefit to you overall. Is alcohol, low-level alcohol can be a medicine. That's the hypothesis. So after I read about the dangers of drinking, I stopped reading. Okay, I love this quote. Quand j'ai lu sur les problèmes de boire d'alcool, j'ai complètement cessé de lire, complètement. So this is the nonlinear dosage response curve. There are costs, but there are also benefits. The curve looks like this. It's very hard to communicate that outcome, but I think it underpins a large amount of human biology and human response to alcohol. And just to finish with Velázquez, los borrachos, the drunkards. This is a divine entity giving the gift of fermentation wine to the mortals, the mere humans, and they all look pretty happy. So alcohol is a fascinating molecule. It inspires us. We use it so frequently, but it can also destroy us. And I think to really understand why, and to really get at how alcohol might have been involved in the origins of agriculture and human civilization, we have to have a deep time evolutionary perspective. So I'll stop there and answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert.
Sure.
Many thanks for this very dynamic talk and enthusiastic talk. We can take some questions in the chat or directly. Does someone has questions for Robert? Yes, Chris, please. We don't hear you, Chris.
Can you hear me now? Yes. Ça va?
Yes.
Okay.
Oui.
It's a very nice presentation, really interesting series of hypotheses and much food, right? Though it may be for thought. What I'm wondering is, there are many other things that ferment and produce alcohol. And I'm wondering if it's more than just ripe fruit, but all sorts of other things, things that actually are distilled and made or fermented to make alcohol. I mean, for example, if one goes away and leaves various things out and not refrigerated, almost all of it rots, and you can smell the rotting, the ammonia and also the alcohol. And I'm just wondering if there are other, if you considered, I think fruit is probably a key one, but are there others that would also perhaps contribute to this?
So I agree with your comment in that many things will ferment. Fermentation is just a general biochemical change in the absence of oxygen and energetic reduction. So most organic compounds will ferment. From the primate perspective, looking at ripe fruits typically contain lots of sugar and then secondarily lipids and some proteins. So the primates are mostly burning sugars, right? It's your just metabolic turnover. But there are lots of secondary products that are produced in the fermentation of fruits, but also if we look at nectars, if we look at saps, so things coming, when a tree is wounded, there are many different saps coming off, and there are many different kinds of fermentation products. And so I think that is just the nutritional background in a rainforest. It's very hard to systematically survey all of these different kinds of products. And the organic chemistry is terrifying. We know how to do alcohol now, we think, but all of these other products, which are providing, some of them are wafting and providing odor cues and other sorts of things, that they certainly could be involved in this as well. Now, modern humans will ferment anything, right? I mean, think of all the fermented foods. I mean, bread is a fermentation product. My coffee, coffee beans are fermented. So I think we like fermentation. And one of the reasons for that, it lets us find ripe fruit, but it also pre-digests food. So we let the microbes do some of the work of breaking down the complex stuff. And it just tastes, fermented food. Think of all I think de Gaulle once said, it's impossible to govern a country that has more than 1,000 kinds of cheese, right? So cheese is a fermented product. Well, think about it. You take animal protein and fat and some sugars, and you just let it sit and you let the microbes go to work. All the blue cheeses, you're putting in mold. And we like it, it tastes good, but the question is, why did it evolve such that it tastes good? I think that's because animals in evolutionary time were exposed to a diversity of fermentation products. That's the hypothesis. Hard to test that, but we know in the real world, things are from, everything's fermenting. The fruits are delicious. I love eating those palm fruit and other fruits in the tropics because of the range of flavors. And I think that's in part what makes us appreciate diversity of cuisine today as well.
Is there any other questions?
Yeah.
Solange?
Okay, and after Bruno, maybe.
Yeah,
So
sure.
it's a general question because so in the big evolutionary history of fermented product consumption, we see maybe a kind of shift with the early domestication. But the thing is that to eat or drink fermented product that we really produce imply to be, say, like a sedentary population, sedentary societies. But do we have any idea on how naturally fermented products are collected and managed in foraging societies, like ethnographically?
Yeah, I don't know about human foraging societies. For primates, there is zero evidence for intentional control of fermentation. It is completely opportunistic. There are anecdotes that animals will store food and then go back to it after it's fermented, but there's no real proof of intent. It just may be a caching behavior more generally, which occurs in many animals. So, what have early humans come up with in terms of caching and intentional control? And even, if we look ethnographically, certainly people store fermented products. That must have occurred prior to the origins of crop domestication. If you have stone or animal skin, you can store things. And Aleksey knows more about this than I do. He's thought about this. So, domestication did not happen overnight. It had a window of 10,000, 20,000 years. There were many experiments in domestication and in storage, but carbohydrate plus water and yeast will always yield fermentation. So somehow that's interacting, I feel, with the psychoactive effects of alcohol to facilitate further storage and control of plants and further regulation of fermentation. I've often thought, others have said this, bread is the origin of civilization, but maybe it's control of yeast is the origin. That was the first domesticated animal, but it's not an animal, but you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm. And just for me, and when did we master distillation processes in human history? I have no idea.
Right, early Middle Ages, I think 1100 Common Era. But okay. There's a series of books called Science and Civilization in China by Joseph Needham, the Cambridge savant. It's a massive series, and he has a whole volume on food products and a big chapter on origins of distillation and of alcohol in East Asia and intentional fermentation. So the evidence is not very clear. The best evidence is that one still, a distillation device in 1100. I think it would have been actually more in the boundary of what is today Xinjiang and Kazakhstan, that area. But of course, that record is very hard to interpret. Yeah.
Thank you. Bruno, sorry.
Yeah, no, you're welcome. Thank you very much for your very nice presentation. And I wanted to know if you have any evidences in the nature related to any kind of taxa about consumption of fermenting honey created by bees or something like this, which could be something supplementary with the foods.
Right, that's a great question, because honey is of course floral nectar, which has then been concentrated and dehydrated basically. So it does not have, it has some resident microbes. It's not fermenting particularly.
Yeah.
And lots of animals go after honey. There are ideas that somehow early humans would have also been collecting honey. And if honey were diluted, you know, the sugar concentration of honey produced by bees is so high that the osmotic pressure kills bacteria. It's a very high sugar content. So honey by itself will not ferment. But if you just dilute honey, either intentionally or accidentally, and it sits around, it will also ferment. There's, as far as I know, there's no evidence in the evolutionary or archaeological record for intentional fermentation of honey. But it's a completely valid hypothesis, right? That easily could have happened alongside domestication of crops.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. There are other questions? Do you have other questions? So maybe we can switch to Aleksey presentation and come back to questions afterwards.
Hello, yes, I will queue it up. Is that
Yes,
okay?
it's okay.
Yeah, so morning, or good evening again.
Yes, good
Good
morning.
afternoon.
So this is the working title of my thesis. And I'll give you just an overview of that, assaying ethanol in the chimpanzee consumed fruits. And I've also assayed ethanol within floral nectar. And then at the end, I'll talk about a postdoctoral fellowship proposal that kind of closer to what you all were talking about at the beginning, as far as the intent of the group, I think. And then, you know, we'll have time for questions. And I have a lot of slides packed in here. So I'm gonna, if you're visually oriented, it's gonna be kind of going quick. But a lot of it reinforces kind of what Robert was already saying. Hominid origins of our ancestors are frugivorous. And then we are, if you're modeled as seed dispersers, you know, we provide that service to angiosperms, and in return, we get some calories. And then the drunken monkey hypothesis adds this fermentative microbes sort of player to this mutualistic triangle where the microbes may provide, as you talked about, antimicrobial defense, and in exchange get calories and substrate, and then indirectly give back to the angiosperm as a service the ethanol-mediated honest signal of caloric presence of fruits in the tropical forest. This is very, very useful. And maybe there's some kind of vectoring services fecally for the life cycle of these microbes. And briefly, when yeast consume alcohol, right, they when they produce alcohol, it's called glycolysis. They're splitting the sugar into two. Our bodies do this as well and store it as I forget the name, lactate. But here we have ethanol, and then some of it can be lost to the environment. And then once alcohol concentrations, sugar levels fall below a certain percentage, yeast will consume the alcohol itself and get the other 18 ATP from that process. And I'll talk a little bit more about the yeast strategy in a second here. So angiosperm evolution began longer than 125 million years ago, but that's kind of right before it started really radiating. These are phylogeny of 36,000 species. And this appearance of angiosperms brought to microbial communities this niche of simple sugars. And so there's been this evolution happening, something called the Crabtree effect, where, I'll describe it in a second, but it evolved 100 million years ago, and this make, accumulate, and consume strategy. And so you can take sugar, and if there is oxygen, then the microbes will use that easier fermentative pathway and just reproduce and make CO2. And then if there is not oxygen, most microbes will also produce ethanol and, or not most microbes, but the fermentative ones will produce ethanol and biomass. Crabtree positive yeasts produce, like brewer's yeast, Saccharomyces, make ethanol even when oxygen is present. And that evolved somewhere between 150 and 100 million years ago when the whole genome duplication in yeast allowed for this kind of alcohol, facilitated alcohol metabolism. So a lot of evolution took place in those first, when angiosperms were first radiating, just by this kind of indirect evidence. Yeah. And then yeast is ubiquitous within plant storage tissues. Here's a study from out of Moscow. So they found more than half of fruits have yeasts that, here's the berries, that live inside of the fruits, nearly always able to reproduce and causing no visible damage. And then I did a deep dive on some of the yeasts that they found, the specific ones. And this Crabtree positive yeast is in 34% of internal tissues of fleshy fruits. And that's, in the summer and fall around Moscow. You can imagine in the tropics. It's much more intense. And then it's ubiquitous in the environment. So it can be vectored in the dust, riding on these little motes all around us, as well as by insects. This is on a fig. And then you can imagine fig wasps are also going inside of figs and introduce all kinds of microbes. All right, so we could add to this mutualistic diagram. Here's a picture of a fig wasp. And, there's this even more complicated mutualistic network, all sort of hinging on this alcohol-mediated side of yeast fermentation. And there's a lot of earlier studies quantifying the actual amount of alcohol in fruits that I did, but they were in species both tropical, and here's some in Finland for berries down in the 80s. But it's never been done systematically in chimpanzees. And so I was in Africa at a field site in East Africa, in Gogo, in Uganda, Kibale National Park. There's a bit of a high elevation, 1,400 meters. These are my collaborators there. And then I also did a season in Tai, which is in Tai National Park, Côte d'Ivoire, where I tried and failed to learn French very quickly. And these are my, this was a Max Planck formerly, and now I think it's Roman is in Lyon. And here's a picture from Ngogo. This is where we had dinner every night. The view, a bit more of a hilly field site. And there are field assistants that and cut trails that are very helpful. Here's a photograph of these are all photos I took throughout the whole talk and videos. So this is the fruit, the number one preferred fruit in Gogo. This is a chimp named Hicks. And it takes up 18%. Another study from the site found 34% of their annual feeding time. And they found that these chimps actually prefer the fruit. It's not just that it's abundantly available. They go out of their way to eat it. Yeah. Same as Robert, there's a little chimpanzees foraging. And, the floor is littered with these, and there's sort of a kind of cycle or a phenological cycle to the fruit crop. Oh, here's the fruit wasps. Yeah, if you're easily squeamish, I should have put a warning up about this, but it's intense. They get in there and they introduce microbes coming in, and then they hatch and they take whatever's in there as and take it with them. So you can imagine that there's a whole microbial ecology involved in this as well. And then in Tai, this is the cutout of a map. Just a nice video of chimpanzees habituated, crossing the road. They just kind of walk around like this. And you can follow them. But don't point at them and say their name. They run away. So here's some camera trap footage where chimps at that site, this is West Africa again, are eating Parinaria excelsa and chewing on these wadges, as they often do, is holding one. And so oftentimes they collect a whole bunch of them and sit and eat them one at a time. And this fruit is 12.5% of the annual feeding time, right? The most popular fruit. Here's a sequence just from camera trap footage. You see they eat one after the other, and there's more of them in the background walking around. Yeah, you could tell it. They eat for a while. They eat all day. And then the second most consumed fruit at Thai, 9.3%, right? So the first two at Thai are about the equivalent of the number one fruit percentage time. And this is Noir, a 9-year-old female of a family I was following, and they soak these fruits in the rivers before eating them. Yeah, so she's already got one soaking. There's another one, I think. And I did measure the dry mass of these fruits, and it's a little bit lower, or it's got a little bit more dry mass, so less water content than the other species. So voila. Methods validation. Yeah, so I used 5 kinds of methods to try to estimate alcohol concentrations in the tropical field site, and they all have pretty good calibrations. This is a portable gas chromatograph. It was kind of wild. And it all involves turning fruit into fruit pulp and exposing it, letting it equilibrate with air in these 3 methods. And then this method is non-headspace. So it's chemical reaction here and a spectrometer, near-infrared spectrometer here. And there's a whole first chapter is going to be, I mean, I'm publishing a methods paper about this with Robert. There's a lot that goes into it, and it's really hard. Is it working at a tropical field site? Here's photos of my lab setup. There's a lot of rain involved. As you can see, a couple of computers, the spectrometer, and equilibrating fruit in tubes. Here's a Thai, same thing as a bunch of fruits that I'm finished processing. Everything's got to get re-sterilized, and eventually I had a proper table put in to work on this. Thai in particular had these really extremely high humidity that made some of my instruments not work properly. But yeah, the validation between the different methods is, at least with wine and beer, is pretty good. Sometimes there's some variation. Mostly I use the method here in the pink color, the green and the orange, and then the spectrometer is it worked well with liquids, but it was all over the place with semi-solid fruit pulp, So here we have the preferred fruits at Thai and preferred fruit in Go-Go, right, about equal percentages. And then the question here is, how do we control for ripeness? So what else do I have to measure about these fruits? Of course, you weigh them. Degrees Brix is a wine industry proxy for saccharide concentrations, as well as ethanol, sort of a combination, and other things that make light. The light passing through the juices refract differently. I also measured puncture force and color absorbance and dry mass in the case of Thai, and fig wasp status of any figs I found. I would cut them open and check, and it's a good proxy for ripeness. The level of development of the wasps corresponds. Okay, so here's an example of a cluster analysis where I put all of these ripeness categories into one analysis in a principal component analysis, and it separates 95% So cluster 1 would be here similar to the unripe fruit, and cluster 2 the ripe fruit. And you can tell the mass increases over time, the color changes of the ripe version of this species. And then the sugar concentrations are oftentimes sort of difficult to match up, and they are oftentimes orthogonal to mass in virtually every fruit. This is like the one pattern that holds true. And what it tells me is that fruits are either small and sweet or big and not as sweet. And I think I'm not collecting fruits that are big and sweet for two reasons: that chimpanzees eat them so preferentially that I almost never find them. And then because as a fruit, when it's small, it can have higher sugar concentrations. As it develops, it sort of gets pumped full of water. And then the sugars become in a more available form than they are in their unripe version. So they more or less, the concentrations stay the same, but become diluted by water from the tree. That's kind of the other half of it. There just aren't as many large and sweet fruits. And I could do this for the other species as well. And then I could look at, well, chimps probably, in this case, the ripeness is just higher fruit quality in general. So chimpanzees will prefer these ripe so-called clustered, quantitatively clustered fruits. And so I will measure ethanol concentrations based on those and not the unripe. Even though chimpanzees oftentimes eat unripe fruits when there's little else to eat. And all of the unripe fruits I collected were collected at times when chimpanzees were eating them. So, and they were probably eating the better quality unripe fruits. Anyway, here is a kind of a more updated graph. So it's a little bit busier. I put everything in here. This green box is the ethanol. And so you could see in this Parinaria excelsa, the most consumed fruit in Thai, there's a significant difference between all of the box plots here. So ethanol color reflectance goes down as the fruit ripens. The purple here, I think, is dry mass decreases, right? So there's more water content. Here, the puncture force decreases, so it takes less force to make a hole in the fruit. Mass increases, sugar increases. Everything kind of predictable. With the second most consumed fruit, this is just ethanol now. And these are two different methods that I use to measure ethanol concentrations. So I'm just showing because it's nice to get this kind of validation from two methods that are significantly different. And then the gas chromatography method at Ngogo for unripe and ripe fruit yielded almost the same alcohol concentrations. They're actually more recent analysis I did a little bit more different, but still surprisingly similar. So at Ngogo, I actually covered 75% of the fruit diet of the chimpanzees in my sampling of 16 species. And there's some studies. There are some studies about the annual percentage time that the Ngogo chimps devote to each of these fruits. And so you can weight or scale the alcohol concentration of each fruit by how much the chimpanzees eat them, and kind of add these up, and I get this 0.35% ethanol concentration by mass on an annual basis. So this is like the number. Okay, so now I'm going to put that number into context. What does 0.35% ethanol concentration mean? And so then we have to ask, what's the total mass of fruit pulp chimpanzees consume? As Robert said, they eat 10 to 15% of their body mass in fruit, but this, of course, differs by age, sex, the amount of fruit available. There's a study within the same park with a different group where they found they eat 6.4 kilos of fruit per day on average. And that's pretty consistent between subadults and adults and the sexes. 71% fruit diet. So actually they consume a lot of leaves, at least 71% annually the amount of time they spent, maybe not in the weight, but if we weight it to 71%, that's still 4.5 kilos of fruit pulp on an annual average. And that translates to something in human terms, 1 standard drink, right? And so 9.5 grams of pure alcohol is in a standard drink. And chimpanzees and Ngogo therefore consume 16 grams of pure ethanol per day on an annual average. And then chimps at Tai, similarly 14.4 grams of pure ethanol. So that's around 1.5 standard drinks per day. And that's it's comparable at both field sites, even though Tai is at a much lower altitude. They're 200 to 300 meters, and Ngogo is 1,400 meters. Still, it's about equivalent, even though at Tai, it's about 8 degrees Celsius warmer on average. So I'll talk about that a little bit later. Meanwhile, all these other animals, and these are all camera trap photos I took with my camera of the animals eating the same fruits that I was assaying for chimpanzees. And so this affects very widely, including this African palm civet, which is amazing. It's got a parinari fruit in its mouth, and it's just a really weird kind of cat-like animal, and but completely vegetarian. It eats fruits from the forest floor. It's amazing. And so this animal is also consuming alcohol, and it would be interesting to know to what extent these small amounts are adding up and affecting its ecology. So we can ask if I did do some collection of rejected fruit, so you can observe when the chimps are eating from the ground, and there are fruits in the end that they end up picking up, holding, smelling, and rejecting. And they don't even always smell it. Sometimes they squeeze it and drop it. And so this, sorry for how blurry this is, but in the Parinari excelsa, in the black circles here are fruits that were rejected, and you can see only 2 of them were in the ripe cluster. And so fruits that are rejected, somewhat predictably, are significantly more tough. They have significantly less sugar, or smaller, and they have significantly less ethanol, as well as more dry mass. And so what this tells me is that alcohol concentrations are kind of difficult to separate from overall fruit quality. The higher the fruit quality, the more likely there is to be some alcohol. But see, the differences, the absolute differences, aren't as big as you might expect. There is still plenty of alcohol, and it's almost unavoidable. So more things to be done in these directions, and I'm going to do some phylogenetic work. I have 20 species of fruit in all. There's accounting for animal foraging and the assessment of available fruit, right? So a lot of the fruits that I see, especially the figs at Ngogo, are rejected, right? They don't really get knocked out of the tree very easily. They're all fruits chimpanzees plucked, palpated, and decided they're not going to eat. So climbing up there and camera trapping and actually repeatedly sampling the crop to see how the properties of the fruits change over time would be a really great study. And it's really fun to climb trees in the tropics. So you can clear the ground of fallen fruit and collect only newly fallen fruit. That's something that would be, you have to sit there and prevent other animals from interfering. Ethanol is enrichment for captive chimpanzees. I tried doing this for my dissertation, and there are a lot of reasons people won't let you give captive chimpanzees alcohol for a formal study. But once I publish some of those studies, there's an argument for the enrichment of captive chimpanzees. This was done with one of Robert's collaborators studied the slow loris and the ii, and the ii was so into the alcohol nectar, the artificial nectar alcohol that they were giving it, that the Duke Lemur Center ended up giving them monthly alcohol as enrichment. So maybe this can be done for chimpanzees. I don't know. Can chimpanzees and other animals smell ethanol plumes? I have some preliminary data on that, but it's an interesting question. And how big are the plumes that they produce? And then, of course, the effects of bulk ingestion of fruit and vis-a-vis alcohol on the behavior of animals, and particularly chimpanzees, social displays. Chimpanzees do patrols of their territories and they get into conflicts with their neighbors, and they are often seen, tanking up on a lot of fruits before they go on these patrols. So they might be affecting them in some of those ways. And then the question of how does their metabolism compare to other species? They are nearest relatives, so maybe if you learn about their metabolism, we can learn about some of the origins of our own metabolism. In that the study of the amino acid coding sequences of alcohol dehydrogenase specifically, and then you can get into population genetics involving other species of humans as well. And I'll get into that for the postdoctoral work at the end. Okay, meanwhile, I also did a little bit of sampling of floral nectar in the botanical garden here with some collaborators, particularly Ammon. And here are some South African species, South Africa on the left and Latin America on the right. And you can tell where these puddles of ethanol are inside of these flowers. I mean, they're just brimming with ethanol. And some of them are a little more difficult, but you stick a little capillary tube in there and you could see the ethanol fills up. And this is another South African flower, honeybush. And there's some collection, it's very manly work, this rugged field work collecting flower nectar. And so we got 228 flower samples from 43 species. Here are the ethanol concentrations, really, really tiny, 0.015%. Use an enzymatic test on this. And so we're pretty confident about these results. And then the Brix levels are, here on the right, close to around average of 20%, what's reported for nectar. And then we have here 11 samples from a particularly cold day. And then within a week, we have 18 samples from a particularly hot day from the same species, the same plant individuals. And there's this really nice effect where the ethanol concentrations are significantly much higher on a hotter day. And so that's sort of a proof of concept. There's 43 species, and then the dominant pollinator syndrome. Here I have it coded to hummingbirds, insects, sunbirds, and then this is other animals, including bats and mammals and other birds. And monocots are on the right and dicots are on the left. And then here we can put it all together, and then the individual alcohol concentrations. And overall, the monocots have less alcohol than the dicots. And it's kind of all over the place. The sunbirds, there's no particular patterns in terms of alcohol otherwise in pollinator syndrome, but the sunbirds do have about 15% Brix or sugar concentrations, whereas the hummingbirds and the insect pollinated flowers tend to have more like 25%. So there's this big difference in sugar concentrations that comes out of the phylogenetic modeling I've been doing here, and not much else. But it is interesting, and some of these are particularly higher. I thought this was a fluke in the sampling. Sometimes, when you sample them, the nectar has a color to it that can interfere with the colorimetry of the method. But this one doesn't have nearly. It has a little bit of color, but not nearly as much to make it such a high concentration. So this is the one species. This is a native species to California, as it were, and yeah. So floral nectar. What's the significance for hummingbirds? You can do the same thing as for chimpanzees. Well, how much nectar do hummingbirds consume? About upwards of 100 to 150% of their body mass, definitely 80%, but For synthetic nectar, like in the San Diego Zoo that houses hummingbirds, they report like upwards of 150% of body mass in artificial nectar consumed daily. In the wild, it's more like 80%. The average, this is, should be 0.15. This is an older number. I thought I updated this, but oh well. So 0.30 on a hot day. And Anna's hummingbirds weigh about 3.5 grams, right? So these percentages come out to about, it's really tiny concentrations of ethanol. But again, if we translate it to standard drinks, then we could do it in grams per kilogram, which is easier in this case. And for a 3.5 kilogram hummingbird, that's consuming about this many grams of pure ethanol. It translates to about 1.4 to 2 standard drinks on an average day and 2 to 3 on a hot day. Now, hummingbirds are tiny, and the smaller the animal species is, the faster their metabolism. So their metabolism is 20 or 100 times faster than ours or something outrageous like that. But again, we don't know the metabolic rate at which they metabolize ethanol. They might metabolize it 20 to 100 times slower innately as the amino acid, then and that would balance things out. Okay, and then for the, I don't know how I'm doing on time. Hopefully not too bad. Oh my God, I'm 30 minutes in. All right, well, the postdoctoral fellowship proposal, working with ancient DNA and looking at European alcohol. Here's a map of the ancient DNA and the modern DNA. Some ages, right? Got some really old samples from Russia, 35 to 39,000 years ago. And we can get this kind of, over time, the derived allele frequency. Here's what alcohol dehydrogenase, commonly present in Europeans. This is over one epoch, so you could see it originated over 40,000 years ago, according to this analysis. And this is of one time bin. And now there's software where you can bin it into separate time bins, and you could see the changes and try to find epochs where you predict there would be a major effect on these mutations and look at suites of them all together. Look at UK Biobank, and there's alcohol intake frequency phenotype, and this is the list of the mutations most associated, and that the one that one of the ones Robert was showing, alcohol dehydrogenase 1B, is very low presence in here we go, in the European population, 2.5%, but very significant. And then this other one that increases in, at least in test tubes, the metabolic rate of alcohol by 150%, something like that, twice, 1.5 to 2 times. And it's also in 63%. And the interesting thing about these mutations is they're the idea of protective mutations, that having these changes to the enzyme, you would think making it faster would make it, you can drink more, but actually it makes it so that people drink less. And the more people that have this mutation, the less they drink. See, there's a negative number for the effect. And so I could look at the top the 28 of these UK Biobank results in sequence like this, starting with the first. And then I could label them as protective versus enhancing, right? So these ones are correlated to, the positive selection is correlated to higher alcohol intake frequency phenotype. And this is positive selection being correlated to a lower alcohol intake frequency phenotype. And if you count these up and you look at the age, most of them that have originated more than 40,000 years ago, all of the ones that help with alcohol metabolism are in that category, and the ones that are more protective also are fairly old, but there's some new ones, so that's more of a recent trend. And that I think it's just some preliminary work, but I think it's really interesting yeah, the possibility for ancient DNA. So there's some acknowledgements for all the stuff, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you very much, Aleksey. So, is there any questions? Maybe I have one. Your postdoctoral project is on. Could you please tell again on what populations is it? What will you consider? Is it on human populations over time periods? Sorry, maybe I missed the information.
Yeah. Sorry, I was going really fast
Oh, yeah.
anyway. But yeah, so this is so it's confined to Europe. Europe leads the world in alcohol consumption. More than 70% of the population drinks, as well as all of the disorders are number one. And then the best sampling of ancient DNA is from around Europe. If I were to do this study, and it would take, for the whole world, it might take 5 or 6 years and involve heavy collaboration with China, where ancient DNA is kind of embargoed. And a lot of this is the most interesting stuff seems to be happening in China, but Europe has its own selection regime with alcohol in terms of alcohol metabolism, as does every part of the world. But again, the ancient DNA sampling is best here. And then these are the modern samples, 14 Finnish, 18 British, just to balance it. And this 187, so 300 samples of humans is computationally tractable amount of data, but there's, the data set that I have access to, there's hundreds more ancient DNA samples. And as it becomes more and more widely available, these are like molecular fossils. We can know the state of certain evolutionary features from ancient DNA.
Okay, thank you very much. There was Solange, then Adeline, then Bruno.
Thank you very much. I got 2 questions. So the first question, so I got the idea that chimpanzees are very territorial animals and highly competitive between groups. Have you observed in the way the chimps access to the fruits a kind of competitive behavior between individuals or between groups? That was the first question. And the second question is about your project on human population. Do you see any regional pattern in the distribution of the protective mutation frequency, the most recent one, let's say?
Yeah, so as far as chimpanzee competition, there is a lot. They have conflicts, but I think mostly they try to avoid conflict. And I've never been on a patrol with conflict, but I've been at dinner with field biologists who were that very day. And from their stories, I mean, you're standing around, you're trying to follow your focal, but at some point there's just chaos and there's chimpanzees running in both directions. And if you're good, they get good at telling them apart. You could actually tell who is going where. And historically, there's the community, habituated community that you're following, and then there's the neighboring community. And when they get into a conflict, the habituated community will run past the human field biologists, and the other community will pursue them and stop dead in their tracks because they're not used to humans. And I thought that was the most interesting. You try not to interfere out there, but there's some ways in which it just can't be helped. And there have been there's at the Ngogo community of 180 chimps formerly just recently underwent the first documented fission event where the community is split. 180 is so many chimps, it's unwieldy, and so they split into 80 and 100, and it started with them, a group of them killing one of their own, a murder, and it's a whole. I think there's a documentary series on Netflix about it, actually. And for the other question, I have not yet started. So you have hundreds of humans, and you have a 1 or a 0 for each mutation, and there's hundreds of mutations, and there are this idea of selection regimes, right? When you have one mutation, you might have a bunch of these other ones that give you a certain phenotype. And the question is, do they separate out that way, where one phenotype helps people to drink, and then the other phenotype is preventing your physiology from drinking? And that is a question, right? Does it really separate out that way? And I haven't gotten that deep into the work yet. Once they give me funding, I'll have 3 years to do it, and really sort it out and separate it from all the other associated lifestyle mutations, like related to diabetes and obesity, right? Because alcohol is difficult to separate from food, and but it might be surrounding all these other changes happening as our lifestyle went from hunting and gathering to more settlered agriculture.
Thank you. Adeline?
Merci, Priscilla. Thanks a lot for your presentation. I was really pleased to see your result. I was actually working in Leipzig at MPI with some of the colleagues, and I would have the question about the Ngogo and Tai chimps. It's a bit similar to Solange's first question. Did it raise the level of aggressiveness within groups? So would you have like conflict within groups because of somehow the increase of alcohol in their blood, for example, if I can phrase it that way?
Yeah, so that would take a behavioral study. That would be maybe like a whole PhD unto itself, to find out. Yeah, behavior is tricky to measure. You can see there's some evidence that alcohol is present, and speculate, well, if they do social displays, there are ranks with chimpanzee males and females, and they're kind of really well studied, and maybe there's some anthropomorphization as well. But a lot of it is actually pretty legitimate. There's an alpha, and in the Ngogo community that was split, the renegade community that did the murdering and then took off on their own, their alpha was this chimpanzee named Raleigh, and he was missing a hand because out there poachers will make snares and to try to trap antelope and other bushmeat, and then the chimpanzees will go in and get the bait, and hand will get snared, and the wire tightens the more they try to take it off. So eventually their hand just ends up falling off or whatever. It's really bad. It kills a lot of chimps, and they have a snare removal team. Anyway, this chimp Raleigh, I was following him and the whole entourage is sitting by a tree, and there's the number 2 chimpanzee, the beta, the biggest supporter of the alpha, if in a stable community, is the second in line. And that chimp walked by Raleigh and reached out his hand, and Raleigh touched his hand with his nub, the hand that doesn't have a hand. And as soon as he touched it, the other chimp went off and started throwing things around and screaming and doing his social display. And this is because if a chimpanzee of a lower rank does a social display in front of a chimpanzee of a higher rank, they're going to get beat up. But if you ask for permission first, which is what the hand contact was, then you're allowed to do it. And all of this involves a lot of psychology. And so if there's a place where the effect of alcohol on social behavior, that's where it would happen. But whether if you eat and fill your stomach with fruit, whether that gives a small bump, it's difficult to say, right? It'd have to be enough ethanol to get into their bloodstream and cross the blood-brain barrier and saturate whatever happens in there.
Thanks a lot. It was really by curiosity. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bruno?
Yes, thank you very much. On one of your graphs, there was a kind of increase of the frequency of I think it was based on the one where there is the chronology for humans. It was with a blue screen. And there was a double, the increase of the frequency was very important from the beginning of the Upper Paleolithic until the middle of the Upper Paleolithic. How would you explain this? Probably, yeah. Yeah, it was the first one, not that one, the previous one. Numbers, yeah, that one. No, the other one.
Yeah.
How do you explain that around 20,000 years before present, you have such an augmentation of the derived allele frequency?
Yeah, so that's a big part of this preliminary finding, is that the alcohol, the drivers, whatever's driving selection of these protective and enhancing SNPs, they all go back to, right, in this case, before 40,000 years. The actual, like the tail end of these graphs is the most difficult to estimate. And I did look, and none of the 4 samples from this far end had this allele. But there's a lot of, this is building on a lot of phylogenetic modeling theories and maths. You know, there's I'm not sure, there's ancestral recombination graph methods that are used in the posterior probability of some Bayesian modeling. There's a lot of computational biology isn't my background, it's what I'll be studying, but so the basis for these is legitimate, but the archaeological evidence, yeah, the oldest evidence we have for alcohol consumption is around 10,000 years archaeologically. I mean, clay pottery maybe goes back 20,000 years in China. But as Robert was alluding, there are many ways of storing alcohol, whether in animal skins or bladders, or, you know, things made of wood. And, you know, there are plenty of stone. We haven't found anything with made of stone where we can scrape and make, analyze the byproducts like 10,000 years ago. But it's feasible that humans have been fermenting and experimenting with food fermentation for much longer than we've appreciated.
Okay, thank you.
Chris?
Thank you, Priscilla. Thank you for the presentation. Again, really interesting. My question is this. I'm wondering, with chimpanzee sociality, how closely it compares to humans. So human sociality. So there are instances of extreme aggression and what has been described as warfare. John Matani is, I noticed he was on your slides and he's talked about that. But what I'm wondering is in humans, what tends to happen is that warriors that are about to go into some kind of aggressive encounter will often they'll become drunk or get drunk. This apparently has a physiological advantage because it increases their level of activity at first. And then after a certain period of time, it drops off. So let's say that a particular warrior goes into battle, has a series of confrontations and is wounded. The drop in physiological responses will actually be advantageous. And I'm just wondering if there's anything similar that's been noted in chimpanzees like that.
Well, can you explain it again? So if a warrior is wounded, the drop in
alcohol acts as a stimulant, and then it becomes a depressant. You can see this in people that are drinking. They get really excited, and then eventually they just sort of, they fall asleep. A lot of people, but with warriors, it was reduction in metabolism. So let's say they're wounded, they wouldn't bleed as profusely. Their metabolism is slower. So it's considered to be advantageous in inverted in quotation marks. And I'm just wondering if that is seen in chimpanzees that engage in aggressive behavior. In other words, does the fruit eating and the consumption of ethanol, is it used in any sort of particular context?
Well, let's see. I'm trying to remember the last time I was in the spring, I saw a talk about chimpanzee male aggression study, and that looked at alpha males hierarchies as well as muscle mass and testosterone as a hormone. And what was interesting is they found that the alpha males do indeed have elevated levels of testosterone and muscle mass, but that they show significantly little aggression. Their alpha males of communities studied by these people don't show as much aggression as you would expect, that it's actually all a lot of the lower ranking chimpanzees that are doing the fighting, and that the testosterone and muscle mass accumulate because of whatever physiological response is released by the social rank of being alpha, and not from the muscular activity of or whatever from the aggression itself, which I thought was interesting. So you could have a phenotype of a warrior without actually being a warrior, but being in the position of one. Which is, but as far as alcohol consumption goes, I don't really can't even begin to speculate on the degree of the effect, but they certainly aren't consuming as much alcohol as like Alexander of Macedon would have to earn himself an early grave. The amount of ingestion is really limited by the size of their stomach. Behaviorally, they can, I think, target crops, and I think I tried to work out the math on the rosiest picture at some point of like 0.5% ethanol on average in the fruits, and what's the largest amount that a chimpanzee eats in a day. The highest number I've seen recorded, unpublished from Thai, is like 9.5 kilos, which amounts to, but that's still over the course of a day. And it's a real question of whether they would feel it. The physiological appetite stimulating effect is good. The extra calories that from the ethanol are helpful for the survival. But again, all the physiological questions of the degree to which ethanol is retained in maybe even facilitated to be in the bloodstream. I mean, we don't know the first thing about chimps, and they were originally studied as an alcohol, a model taxa to study alcoholism in the 60s. And it was really hard to find this study, but some people in Georgia, there used to be a federal facility housing chimpanzees, and they gave them voluntary 10% cocktails, and they would alternate the days. They would give them sometimes just the fruit and sometimes 10% alcohol in the fruit. And some of the chimps wouldn't touch the alcohol ever. Like once they smelled it or tried it, they wouldn't at all consume. And some chimps really consumed as much alcohol as they possibly could, and everything in between. The ones that consumed as much as they possibly could, the limit was they would keep giving them up to 4 liters for an hour. And so the maximum was like 13 or 14 standard drinks. And they wrote that chimpanzees, they would notice locomotor ataxia at around 8 or 9 drinks in chimpanzees. They noted a lot higher than they would expect to notice it in humans. So maybe chimpanzees even have more of a resilience, at least, again, anecdotally, than humans do.
So the key, I guess, is it's not only that you have ethanol, but it has to be concentrated enough to get into the bloodstream. And I think that's what humans seem to have where they have their advantage. They can have ways of concentrating it so that, and with some people it takes very little, if nothing at all, and some people become violently ill immediately. And I think it's the concentration. I think going back to Bruno's question about honey, I think is a really interesting one, because honey can be incredibly constant. I mean, wow, if you're drinking hydromel, fermented honey, it's really powerful.
Mead.
So mead, yeah, thanks. Yes, in English, mead. Yeah. And I think that might be a really important detail here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've seen chimps in Thai going after honey. It's a very fraught activity and involved a lot of injury and running at various points. But they're intensely curious. Chimps will eat anything. I got videos. I didn't show them eating mushrooms and all kinds of. They're very experimental, but they don't make a cachet. Robert asked me to look out for it. If they'll take fruit and then they'll take fruit and eat it. Maybe sometimes they'll leave it, but they'll never go back and eat fruit that they've stored before. that would be, that I think is the anthropological sort of missing link in this.
Yeah, yeah. It's an interesting it's important observation. Yeah, they don't store things. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Luc shared some papers within the chat about flour production in early to mid Upper Paleolithic times within many within Europe, but also including Czech Republic, Russian sites from the very early Gravettian times until, or maybe Aurignacian, eventually, until mid or late Gravettian times. So thank you, Luc. Luc.
Yeah,
Yeah,
sorry.
maybe you want to say something about that.
Sorry, yeah, it's just following Bruno's comment about why is there an increase at 20,000, and it just made me think about these recent papers on flour production or flour processing, wild grain processing, and who knows if there's a link there, but entirely speculative. Just might be worthy to know it.
No, but for sure, it's a very good idea to send this paper, because if the results are right, and I think that they are following the 2001 published in the PNAS, if people at that time have produced such a capacity to modify the veggies, for sure they put them in the water and they were able to produce alcohol.
And anyway, making bread is basically also a process of fermentation, and it's in some ways. So the two could have evolved in a fun co-evolve.
Yes,
co-evolve in a fun way.
You actually get
very quickly.
Yeah, you get more calories out of alcohol made with grains overall than you would just the grains on their own.
Well, the other important point is that alcohol is an antimicrobial agent, so it's a preservative. It prevents spoilage, so it increases the longevity, the shelf life of any processed product. So it can be an appetitive stimulant, a feeding attractant, but it also, anytime there's been intentional manipulation of food products, it can basically make them last longer. It can help predigestion of hard things to digest. And so I see only positives until the invention of distillation, and then it all went badly wrong.
So Middle Age.
We can blame it on the Middle Ages.
Okay, finally we always blame Neolithic times, but finally medieval times are worst. Okay. I think it could be a conclusion, because for us it's already 6. A lot of people had to go to schools to
pick up children.
Pick the children. So and we will let you begin your day. And thank you very, very much for your presentations and the exchanges. It was very rich. And someone in the chat said, le whisky est une mauvaise chose, surtout le mauvais whisky. Georges Bernard Shaw. Okay. Thank you very much, Nicolas, in the chat.
Very good.
And yes, we keep in touch. And good luck for your postdoc, Aleksey. It sounds great. We look forward to hearing more about your results on Paleolithic times.
Yeah, looking forward to reading some of y'all's literature.
Yeah, great. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Have a nice day or evening.
Yes. Yeah, a nice holidays, a nice Christmas. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Happy New Year.
Bye-bye.